Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have a guest from Los Angeles today, a fellow Armenian, Antranig Kzirian. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
You know, one thing that is always fascinating with Armenians, or just people in general, is the origins of the last name. So a little bit about the origins, if you know the history behind your last name.
Yeah. So Kzirian, the IAN is a suffix, which means descendant of or son of, and the word is Kzir, which, from my recollection, means something along the lines of like a government official, like a regional governor or administrator within a bigger federal government.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. There you go.
One of the reasons that we're talking now, I mean, although I would have loved to have you at any point in your career, but is the new album that's coming out. Why don't you share a little bit about the album, the people you're collaborating with, and all that stuff?
Yeah. So I play the oud, which is an acoustic stringed instrument that is played all over the Middle East and Armenia and Anatolia. And I've been playing this instrument for a long time. So given schedules and how busy I was with other projects, I finally had a chance over the last couple of years to record my own record for this instrument. So the name of the project, the name of the record is Noud, N-O-U-D. And I'd say the meaning behind it is kind of my reimagination of the instrument and its place in modern times in a contemporary context. So I figured it would be a cool way to represent that concept in a simple word, oud with an N in front of it. And it's basically, you mentioned collaboration. I viewed this as a collaboration with myself, for lack of a better way of explaining it, because most of my musical life, I have collaborated with so many different artists. I've been so enriched and lucky to work with so many people, whether it was my band Visa or another group, String Harmonies, or various other projects, Aravod, from when I was younger. So I figured it was time to finally focus on myself a little bit and also the instrument and give the instrument a chance to be featured on its own and really show what it could do.
There is one collaboration though, and that is the person who designed the album, from what I understand, right?
Yeah, artistically, yeah. So, well, I'm really glad you brought that up. When I was first thinking of how to present this record, I wanted it to be along the lines of what I was saying before about it being modern and different. And I'm a very, very visual, artistic person, so I thought, what better way to represent the instrument and breathe some new contemporary life into it than to have artistic visual renditions and depictions of the instrument and what it would translate with an artist drawing based on the music I was playing.
Yeah.
So one of my very good friends down here in the Los Angeles area, his name is Simon Majarian, very talented graphic designer and artist. We started discussing what we could do for album artwork. And then I said, you know what, why don't we do a visual for each track, for each song that I'm recording, each medley. And he was super excited about it. So we started working together, and I would send him samples of my music as I was recording over the past year and a half. And he would send me designs, and we'd go back and forth. And he did an amazing job capturing the sound, the spirit, the soul of the instrument. And it was an important component of the project because I really wanted that visual interpretation to kind of add a new dimension to the music, and he nailed it. He did a really good job.
Wow. Going right into oud and your transition to being a oud player. And by the way, I was going to ask you, is you in a lot of bios that I've read about oud players, it says oud player, but I also read a word that said oudist. Do oud players like that word?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've seen oudist as well, which is just, I guess, a simple way to add the suffix representing that the person plays that instrument like you would for a guitarist or a bassist.
Of course.
But to me, I mean, it might not mean much to most folks, but oudist is, I don't know, it seems like a bit of a trivialization of it.
Yeah.
But that's just semantics.
Yeah.
Because when I was thinking of how to have like a stage name or what I would be called or any kind of artistic component, oudist it just didn't work. It just didn't feel right. So the oud player, or I've even seen like into some things when people ask for my credits, how do I want it to look? I'll say, interpreter of the oud or oud practitioner, something a little more representative of what you're doing with the instrument.
Yeah.
Because oud, it seems like it doesn't capture enough.
Yeah.
That's my ambiguous rave on that.
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know about the oud, obviously, we live in a world where it's so easy to just look something up. But for those of you who don't know, when looking at an oud, the one instrument that I could, I guess, connect it to as far as the way it's held, the shape and all that is a guitar, which most people commonly know. Guitar is much wider known than the oud, obviously. But one thing that was very interesting, where I read, I think it was in your paper or maybe in your bio, is that most oud players transition from a violin to an oud, and you had a classical music background playing classical guitar and then transitioning to oud. That sounds so weird to me. Violinist to oud. It sounds more like most people would transition from a guitar to an oud.
Yeah, see, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, that was in my research. I discussed that because when I was a youngster, all of the other oud players around me, many of whom were from generational musical families, many of them played the violin as well, and I'll explain why that makes sense. Given that the oud is a fretless instrument, it does have a lot in common with the violin. That's the first point. Number two, because of the geographic and cultural origins of where the instrument comes from originally, there were really no guitars in that part of the world, or at least they were not used commonly by a lot of the musicians. So in the Middle East, in what is today Turkey, the Caucasus, those areas, 100, 200 years ago, there may have been guitars, but those were not common folk instruments in those regions, and the oud was. So the violin being introduced by Napoleon hundreds of years ago, the violin was also common in those areas as well, both classical and folk. So the oud and the violin kind of had a relationship musically, both physically with the fretlessness, and then also for some historic reasons, like I just said.
Yeah.
With all that said, the guitar is related to the oud because they are both plucked stringed instruments with acoustic resonant bodies. Some say the oud is the grandfather of the guitar.
Wow.
But to me, that kind of doesn't really do the oud justice, because the oud is still a very widely used, all over the world, contemporary instrument. It's not some ancient treasure chest that is dusted off once in a while. In a lot of music in most of the world, outside of the U.S. and outside of the West, the oud is everywhere in Asia, Europe, Africa. So it definitely is contemporary, but of course the guitar is more common. But I mean, that's kind of the relationship between the two. Now, what does that matter for me? I started playing the guitar, and I grew up in Philadelphia on the East Coast. So as I was saying before, a lot of the oud players had a violin background because of those historic reasons. Their families were from Western Armenia, which is Turkey today, and they came from areas where the oud and the violin were more commonly played instruments. So when their ancestors came to the U.S., during the genocide era and soon after, they brought those instruments with them. The guitar was more of a discovery in mainstream music for them when they came to the United States.
Yeah.
So given that my family, I have a little bit of a musical background in my family, but not as much as many of the other oud players.
Yeah.
So when I was playing, I was pretty much one of the first, like me and my brother were the first ones in our family that played music.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at least, growing up in the States. So picking it up, guitar was something I saw as a youngster. I wanted to play it, so my parents supported it, thankfully. And then I had always known about the oud. I'd always seen it around. So I, latched onto it immediately, wanted to learn. I was enchanted by it. I was lucky to have some teachers who could show me the ropes. But I noticed how my training, my background, my understanding was very different than some of the violin players. And it was an interesting distinction and contrast.
Yeah, well, sometimes when you have a new approach to it, or a different approach, or not just to any instrument or any field, somehow you bring something new to the table. It's interesting how it works. There are composers who maybe didn't have a formal training for classical music, for example, not much of a formal training, and they all of a sudden they're the voice of their generation, and they know how they do things that are unconventional, and somehow it becomes groundbreaking. But I was,
no, that's a very good point. Very
yeah.
good point.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about something. You said family. Was your family supportive of you playing the oud? The reason why I ask is because you wrote in your paper, you said, like Dinkjian, Hoplamazian told the story of being denied permission to play the oud by his father. Why do you think that? Because it seems like, in your paper, in your research paper, you talked about, being denied, some of these players being denied by their families to play the oud. What's the reason behind it?
Okay, that delves into a lot of socio-history and ethnomusicology topics.
Mm-hmm.
Because aside from being a physical, tangible thing, this instrument,
Uh-huh.
It represents a lot more in the Armenian psychology and the Armenian historical experience. So the oud was the main instrument for many of the genocide era Armenians.
Wow.
And because of that historical coincidence and tragedy, when they fled, with whoever survived, the instrument came to represent home and suffering and the pain of what was experienced. Mm-hmm. So there was a very delicate sensibility, a very harsh pain and memory of the past, in terms of what they had, how they had toiled and suffered so much, and the instrument was a reminder of that. So a lot of families, at least when I interviewed these musicians and these generational families where the oud was part of their family for so long, they would talk about that dynamic. And it was something I kind of always suspected, but I hadn't experienced it as directly with my grandparents who were born in America and, their experiences growing up in the U.S. They weren't musicians per se, but they would see the oud played at picnics and social functions. So for them, it was a very prominent, visible part of their culture, like their diaspora community life. So, of course, if a grandchild or a child or a relative played the oud, it was a big deal. It was like a badge of honor. My grandparents were, even when I was a kid and we were starting to play music, they would always say, Antranig, we want him to play the oud.
Wow.
We would love if he played the oud. It was a big deal on the East Coast.
Wow.
So that's how it's referenced through their eyes, but they were not musicians. In musician families, as those interviews demonstrated, there was a very sensitive, like a hypersensitivity to what the instrument represented. It was beautiful. It was theirs. It was their heirloom, but it was also associated with where they came from, where they were persecuted and killed. So there's a lot of complexity there as to what the instrument represents.
Yeah, another thing from your paper, which it was very interesting. For those who don't know, I'll definitely put a link to the paper because it tells a lot about the history of oud and some of the important people that you've interviewed for that research paper. But one of the things is you said the Armenians as one of the oldest people in the region have contributed greatly to the advancement and understanding of the ancient and soulful instrument. Well, one thing is that I really want to know your perspective and your ideas. How is Armenian oud playing different from the cultures and people of the region? What has Armenia really contributed to the oud?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's one of the topics that I addressed in the paper because many have asked that question and with good reason. So that answer, my perspective, has a few different layers. One is, you can't just look at the instrument itself. You have to look at the context historically of where it came from. Armenians were a minority in the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. However, like other minorities, Greeks and Jews and others who lived in that empire as well, they contributed greatly and substantially to culture, art, politics, architecture, cuisine, and various aspects of Ottoman life over centuries. Some of the most prominent composers were Armenians. They were the Mozarts and Beethovens of the Ottoman Empire. And the oud, over time, was instilled in many Armenian players. Some of the master musicians, the most famous songwriters and composers, many of them were Armenian. Kemani Tatyos Efendi Emkecyan, Oudi Hrant Kenkulian. I could go on and on. There were so many who were prominent figures over the years and decades and centuries of that period. The oud was kind of their guitar. It was like their folk instrument through which they communicated, and the important distinction is in a classical way. So there was this kind of hybrid melding of classical and folk, And that shows so conspicuously in their descendants of that tradition with the Armenian oud players of the East Coast. Post-genocide, where the immigration waves after 1915, there was a revitalization, a resurgence in Armenian culture because Armenians had survived. They had come and found their footing. They were bringing their culture back. They were celebrating their survival. And there was such a rich canon of new music and so many talented Armenian oud players who were bringing the instrument back, trying so many different styles. John Berberian, Richard Hagopian from Fresno, Chick Ganimian. George Mkhitarian. There was countless oud players, many of whom are still around today in New England and the Mid-Atlantic and Philly and New York, etc. And what makes the Armenian oud style different is that Armenian oud players, because of the historical tradition of mastery and ability and versatility, they demonstrated that their ability was to play anyone's music.
I see.
That was the distinction, and I talk about that a little bit in the paper. Because of where they came from, where it was so diverse and so multicultural, and because they had achieved so much as a people and contributed so much to their society, the Armenian style of oud playing was to spread that little bit of Armenian genre, those signature Armenian melodies, little moments of melodic notes and interpretations, and infuse it into the music around them. And you can see it in a lot of Ottoman historic classical compositions. I mean, there are stories of Turkish composers, they would sneak to the Armenian church because they wanted new ideas for their music. And they heard from the Armenian composers how enriched and varied and complex these new melodies were and how it elevated their own music. And if you kind of take all that together, you can really see what the strength of what the Armenian oud tradition was. It was to create versatility, strength, and interpretation of so many different styles with artistic integrity.
Does oud have a future for Armenians if the Armenians from Armenia don't take on the instrument as effectively and passionately as the Armenian Americans have? Because there's that one thing you said about oud was barely present in the traditional Armenian orchestras and ensembles from Armenia. So how is the oud tradition, or not the tradition, but how is oud represented in Armenia, in the present day Armenia, and does oud need Armenia to survive?
That's a very good question. To answer the present, you kind of have to take a quick glimpse of the past. So survivors from the genocide went in many directions, all over Europe, South America, North America, other parts of the Middle East, and also in what is today the modern Armenian state. So when someone to what I would call the Eastern Armenian culture, the Eastern Armenian society, there were also people from Western Armenia who went there, and they took their ouds with them too. And because Armenia had recently Sovietized when it was invaded and taken over, Armenia was subject to the same Soviet social engineering and cultural engineering policies that all of the Soviet republics were subject to.
Of course.
Which involved taking instruments from various regions that had nothing to do with each other and creating a monolithic culture artificially because of political reasons. They wanted the perfect Soviet citizen.
Of course.
And that was implemented in many ways. On the artistic front, it was implemented with suddenly newly appearing instruments and ensembles that were engineered for their own political policies. And Armenia was the same as all the other republics. They went through the same process. So in that, what does that mean for Armenia? Those same kind of controversial taboos that were dealt with on the East Coast were also in Eastern Armenia as well, because the instrument came from Western Armenia, from Turkey, what is today's Turkish state. So if you put two and two together, okay, I don't see the oud much, or if I do, it's playing counterpoint. It's not a lead melodic instrument. It's not playing solo interludes. It's not providing lead melody. Okay, so when you read into it and you see other instruments featured more, you can kind of see the political component there, because the instrument came from another identity. It came from another place. And, it kind of just shows today. However, I will say in terms of what it means today, I've seen a revitalization in Armenia. There are some makers who have been coming up, luthiers, who are taking the instrument seriously, improving their quality, there's always been a fascination because so many Armenians in Armenia do have Western Armenian roots.
Of course, yeah.
So there's always been an awareness, an appreciation, a knowledge of history. So I think the oud is not as much of an undercurrent unknown as some might suspect.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of where does it fit in the modern Armenian cultural music identity, which is, of course, dominated by the duduk.
Yeah, of course.
So, and the duduk, as I discuss in my paper, what is today's duduk is not the historic duduk. It was basically created about 100 years ago, which is fine. I mean, instruments all the time are restructured, improved, re-engineered. But the social impact there is the oud has kind of been cast aside as a reminder of taboos, stigmas of another time. Mm-hmm. But again, over time, those kind of things erode. Awareness builds, and that one of the things I take pride in with playing this instrument is to restore what the instrument was, because I don't think it's really fair, or I think it deprives a lot of people of what the meaning and value of the instrument was for historic reasons.
Yeah. Tell me this, what's the 11-string oud and the 13-string oud? And you played 11-string oud, right?
Well, it's hard to classify it like that because the historic ouds from the Ottoman period, when there were the Renaissance, the golden era of all the different oud makers, many of whom were Armenian and Greek, they played ouds that had 11 strings, but very different than what I play.
I see.
Those ouds did not have a low octave single string at the very top.
Okay.
They had the 5 middle courses of the oud, which are all in unison pairs. Mm-hmm. And then they had a high single string cheater string, which was the highest in pitch.
Oh, okay.
So those were the traditional ouds that were played for a very long time. Then when the instrument made its way to the United States, and also when it was modernizing itself in Turkey, there was a movement to add a lower bass string to be more guitar-like, mm-hmm. to add a low E string, which is the same as a guitar. And then that high cheater string was abandoned. It kind of melted away over time.
Okay.
Some of the old ouds that are still preserved in various museums, actually when I saw Barsamian last night, who's a very good musician and oud player, he recently played one. It's an oud by a Greek legendary oud luthier named Manuel. Mm-hmm. And his ouds, some of them have the cheater string. That's how old those ouds are. They're over 100 years old.
Wow.
So when you play those ouds, and you can hear it on old recordings by Oudi Yorgo, Bajanos, mm-hmm. They have that different tone, a very brilliant, bright, crispy, high-pitched resonance because of that cheater string. Mm. And it makes it sound like they're playing high up on the fingerboard of today's oud, but of course, you would never get that same timbre because the instrument, the strings are different gauges, and they're also not catgut like they used to be. They're just nylon strings now. Mm. So it's an interesting distinction that you see between the different types of ouds, the number of strings. I've seen experimental ouds with, some made out of different materials like carbon, like, not wood.
Wow.
I've seen different string counts. There's all kinds of modern innovations that push the envelope. For example, I play an electric oud. Wow. For many of my live performances for simple feedback prevention.
Wow.
So the instrument, just like any other, has experienced a lot of innovation and improvement technologically. But I think that's great because it helps keep the instrument current and breathing in today's world.
Yeah. How much is improvisation a part of what you do, and how much is improvisation a part of your new upcoming album? And it's called Taksim, right? The improvisation in Turkish, is that what it's called?
Yes. Taksim is a word that represents the art of interpreting makam, uh-huh. which is a name for modal scales.
Yeah.
And makam are less than a song, more than a scale, if that makes sense. Huh. Because they have simple note orderings like any Western key music would, but they also have rules of interpretation. Huh. And to an informed audience, an informed listener, they would be able to recognize the artistic interpretation and movements of a knowledgeable Taksim interpreter.
Wow!
So it's not it's kind of its own world of music. Mm-hmm. It's something that I've studied for a long time. I studied with Bilezikjian when I moved to Los Angeles for a couple of years. I studied with Ara Dinkjian when I was in grad school in New York City. So learning Taksim it's a very different musical tradition than the West. So growing up in the United States and being surrounded by Western music, it was a challenge for me to wrap my head around what Taksim was. And it's very enriching and very different. And there's this purity and simple beauty to what it is. It's something that, for example, I'm releasing this record. The 12 songs I do, I don't really do a Taksim in the songs. I do plenty of solos, which are improvisational Taksim based, where I move through the modes. But my bonus track, which I'm setting it up promotionally, my bonus track will feature a traditional saz semi, which is a classical form of Ottoman music, by an Armenian composer, which features a Taksim as the introduction. And in that kind of piece, they're microtonal. So some of the notes are not what Western listeners may be accustomed to hearing. So on the record itself, I didn't put it, but it will be the bonus track, which is kind of like a sneak peek behind the curtain of the mystical origins of the oud and the makam modal system that drives Taksim.
And I don't know how much of this you want the listener to know, but Take 5 was on one of the tracks on your album, right?
Yes, correct.
Why Take 5?
Okay. Yeah, I know, right? To a listener who doesn't know the history, it's just very random. So Take 5, obviously, Brubeck and Paul Desmond, huge jazz classic in 5/4 time. And the story of that, I'm sure many people maybe do know if they're jazz enthusiasts. They were fascinated by the time meters that they heard when they were in the Middle East. They heard musicians playing all these odd time signatures that they weren't used to hearing, so it influenced them to write songs. I think there's even a story how Brubeck thought it was a 9/8, but it wasn't, which is interesting in and of itself.
Interesting, yeah.
But the reason why I put it on the record is one of the Armenian American oud, giants of the last 40, 50 years. His name was George Mkhitarian, fellow Philadelphian. Went to Juilliard for clarinet and was a phenomenal oud player, innovator. Brought the oud, one of the oud players who brought the oud into the modern age. He recorded Take 5. And when I was a kid and I heard that, it blew my mind because I didn't even know what jazz was when I was like 10 or 11 years old. And I heard this oud. I mean, on the rest of his record, he had traditional pieces, but he experimented with this jazz piece, and it was just completely enchanting. Wow. And for years, it would be on my playlist. I would always listen to it. I would always play along. I tried to learn it when I was a kid. And then over the years, I just would always, like, when I would sit down and tune my oud, I would be like, I'd just play it. I'd gravitate towards it because of that influence from him. And when I was going through what songs I wanted to record, I said, I have to do Take 5 as a tribute to George. Yeah. I had a special kinship with him as an oud player. He was from the same city where I grew up. And I had learned so much from him over the years. I mean, he was the first oud player to play with an orchestra in New York, I believe it was.
Wow.
So he did a ton of amazing things. He even came to LA several times to play in the 70s. There's recordings of him on reel to reel. So I just had to do it. And I love odd time signatures, which are a staple of the kind of music I played as a kid. It was just a perfect fit. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take 5 that George did. I'll add a little bit of harmonic development. And then he does a solo in the middle of his song. And I said, I'm going to do one, but I'll do it my way. And I wanted to explore some different modal development and movement in the solo. And I tried to, explore as many different colors as I could in that time signature. And it was a lot of fun to record that. It was great.
I have a Blitz section of my podcast, which is fairly recent, but you have to answer these questions quick. Well, you could try, but it's okay. And you don't have to be serious if you want to answer whatever you want to answer or not answer. So, anyways, here are some of the questions. What is your favorite word?
Shambolic.
Least favorite word?
Disruption.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally?
A well-executed, simple melodic line played on the oud.
What turns you off?
A poorly executed melodic line on the oud.
What sound or noise do you love the most?
Sound. sound, the sound of my daughter when she says "dada."
Noise or sound that you don't like?
The barking of a small Chihuahua dog.
What is one profession that you would absolutely not like to do?
I would not like to be. Oh man, that's a good one. I don't know. I haven't even given thought to anything like that. I've been so happy playing music in addition to my day job.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. All right, let's throw out. I would not like to be a laborer in a factory. With no offense to hardworking laborers.
These are a couple more questions, but these are you don't have to answer them. So Blitz, but a life-changing moment, whether it's personal or professional or maybe both.
Life-changing moment was the birth of our daughter.
And
I mean, I can elaborate. It depends on your question.
Well, you could go for it. Elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very it is life-changing, a tectonic shift in life, but it's something that it really your perspective is modified so much because it becomes all about caretaking and nurturing and growing, and how you want this new person who has been birthed, how you want them to experience life and be a good person and learn and just be around and help enrich your experience, and you can enrich theirs through what you teach them. For example, I love playing music for my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from children's music she listens to as part of her adolescent development, I sit down with my oud and I perform for her, and I play with her all the time in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing the look on her face, and as they start to understand what the music is and hearing it, it's very, very rewarding.
A record that inspired you, a record or a couple of records growing up that inspired you to be a musician?
Wow. See, this is a dangerous question because I grew up in the 90s. I came of age as a teen in the 90s. So I'm going to have maybe some cliched answers from people who have similar age groups as me.
Uh-huh.
Pearl Jam's 10 record was a huge influence on me.
Uh-huh.
And some other records of that same era. Because, I mean, obviously the music industry is so different now, but back then if you got signed, you became a colossal giant globally with marketing and visibility, and then it would affect people like me who were kids, right?
Yeah.
But Pearl Jam 10 was a huge influence on me. I enjoyed how soft their rock was, with the sensuality of their the sound of their music, the lyrics. That I would say that was the biggest influence on me from like a rock mainstream perspective.
Uh-huh.
Regarding my other background in Armenian and Middle Eastern music, man, I could go on. There's so many. I used to just listen to oud players all day. And I think that's kind of what influenced me in my other project, Visa, because I had this Armenian, Middle Eastern oud background that I was inundated and just immersed in it so much. And then I grew up with rock music, as I was a big rock fan. So mixing oud and rock is kind of this very interesting dichotomy, and there you have it. That's kind of what I am musically.
The future of oud for Armenian Americans, and you have a number of students, which you told me about when we were preparing to talk on this podcast. But the future of oud, what you see in the future generation of people that you teach, and also just what you see in general, maybe people who are a little bit younger than you, not very young, but just maybe in their early 20s studying oud. Do you see a future?
Yes, I'm happy to say that I do. The one caveat, however, is because the instrument is not as prevalent and commonplace growing up in the States, it is extra challenging for anyone to pick it up. It really is a labor of love. I don't want to call it a lost art, because I think there are enough musicians and enough awareness and visibility where it's not that, but it has hints of that feeling. And I notice it with my students. The ones who are really into it and passionate, they have this undying thirst and hunger for knowledge and what the instrument means. It's very mystical and different and soulful for them, which is what I felt when I was exposed to the instrument. It was, and that goes back to kind of coming full circle what you said about the stories where the musician said, "Don't touch it." there are undertones of that with when I meet students who are so passionate and they want to learn, and I try to tell them, look, it's just like any other instrument. Yes, it may be magical, it may be so interesting, and if anyone can understand it, it's me. But just like anything else in life or any other instrument, you need to put the time in and practice and refine your art. And I mean, when I was a kid, I used to practice for hours per day, sometimes 5, maybe even 10 hours.
Wow.
Because I was so into it. I would not go to, I would cut class like a bad kid wouldn't make do. But I would be doing it because I was playing and listening and just playing along with stuff.
Wow.
Because I was driven to learn this thing.
Wow.
And in that sense, it's like anything else, like any other art form. You know, you have to just put the time in and have your dreams meet the reality.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, since it's tough, is there, for violinists, for most of the instruments out there, there are certain books or techniques or just places where people could start or students could start early on and somehow help them learn the basics of the instrument and then develop them into intermediate and advanced levels. Most of the instruments, especially Western instruments, have these method books. Is there a method book for the oud?
Yes, I'm aware of a method book put out by one of my former instructors, who I mentioned earlier, John Bilezikjian. He has since passed away a couple years ago, unfortunately. But Bilezikjian, in many ways, like Mkhitarian George, John Bilezikjian was an innovator of the oud as well, based out of the Los Angeles, Orange County area. And he put out a method book. And it's great. It covers the basics. It gives players an idea of what the forms are, what the notes are, the locations. It can be helpful, but the oud, in my opinion, the method book is a help and it can be a complement. But I really think because of how nuanced the playing of the oud is, because again, you're combining guitar pluckability, although the plucking is very different, but it's still plucked, with the fretlessness, which is more violin or string-like.
Yeah.
So because of the hybridity of the oud, in terms of guitar and violin-like origins, you really need an instructor.
Yeah.
And I found, if I give my students something to do on their own, their progression is much less rapid than if I was sitting there showing them the nuances and then I let them go try it on their own.
Wow.
Then they can develop on their own much faster if I just show them one or two things, and then I can kind of set them free and let them fly away and do what they want. But again, that's just my experience. But then again, when I moved to LA, just like in Philly, I had instructors. I was so hungry to find new teachers, and I went to John because I needed to learn. Like, the book was not going to get it done, And when I was in New York, I said, Ara, you live right across the river. I have to come learn from you.
Yeah.
And that personal instruction is essential. It's so critical, especially because it's such a rare instrument and there are not many who play it. So my advice would be, wherever you live, if you want it, if you love this instrument, if you need to learn and are desiring to learn, try and find someone, or do the best you can to locate someone who can teach, or if you can see YouTube videos or something to visually see it and hear it.
You've played with a long list of artists, and I don't want to say anyone's name. I'll let you do that if you want to. But an unexpected collaboration, maybe an artist that you knew about but you didn't expect that they would want an oud or in their music or in their album, and you get a call, or maybe they ask you to collaborate with them. An unexpected collaboration that you weren't expecting, I guess.
Yeah. Unexpected collaboration of the oud, it definitely has to be Capital Cities. When I worked with Sebu Simonian, who's one of the founders, one half of that duo. He's a great friend, and he also was a recording engineer and even helped us produce some of our Visa records in years past. So Sebu is someone we know very well, very good friend of mine. And when he called me when Capital Cities got signed, and he asked me to play the oud, I was like, "Are you kidding?" Capital Cities is pop, alternative dance. It was kind of a very different genre, and it was fascinating that he was interested. He said, "Well, I want to do something different. I want there to be an Armenian flavor. I want to do something revolutionary, bold." Which, that my whole history of the oud is all of those things.
Yeah.
So it was a great fit, and we already were friends and knew each other well. So I went in and we had a lot of fun. I played on one of the tracks doing an oud solo on their debut record. So I would say that was pretty unexpected.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun. A lot of the other collaborations were, not that they were expected or unexpected, but they were more of kind of naturally occurring phenomena where I would expect the fit to be what it was based on who we knew and the style. But yeah, the capital cities, I'd say, would be the one.
You know, and there's many people out there who are gonna, you know about this album, and it's nice that it's getting coverage. And I saw some of your recent postings. A number of news agencies have posted about that. So it's nice that it's getting coverage. But for those who are still, you know, not familiar with the oud, why should they get this album, and what's something new that you're bringing to the table as sort of the younger generation of oud players compared to Ara Dinkjian or some of your other mentors and teachers?
Yeah, well, I look at this record as, you know, the interpretation of, well, first off, I do some covers of previous songs, but I do them my way. I do them through the eyes, through the experience, through the vantage of someone who's, you know, 20 or 30 years younger than a lot of the other oud players.
Yeah.
That learned from them, but also had his own influences. It's kind of like, you know, 2.0 or 3.0.
Yeah.
It's a new version of some of these more traditional songs. And then, more interestingly, at least in my opinion, I have several original pieces that are on the record.
Wow.
So it's a chance to hear my songwriting perspective, my abilities, you know, the things that I'm driven by, the melodic construction and harmonic accompaniment that I came up with for these songs overall. And then also, on top of all that, the way I recorded it, I would say, compared to a lot of traditional oud recordings, it was just done differently. I don't want to give away too much of what that is. I'm kind of hoping people will be interested as part of why they would like to, you know, get the album.
Yeah.
But there's something a little different about, you know, lo-fi versus hi-fi in terms of how I recorded the instrument.
Interesting.
I also used multiple ouds. I used 2 different ouds on this record.
Wow.
So there's different tonality, different frequencies, different response of the instruments. And then also, as we discussed earlier, I think the visual depictions add a great touch to, you know, that artistic visual interpretation and depiction of the songs.
Yeah.
So I think as a record itself, I think it really stands on strong footing to give the audience, the listener, the fans something really, really cool to check out.
Yeah. Antranig, it was an absolute pleasure. Anything we missed? We could go on talking about this, and I still have notes. But anything else we missed, or maybe we could have you back after the album is released, and we could talk about how that was received and what your ideas were, or what your thoughts were about that whole process. But anything that we missed that you want to talk about now?
No, I think this was great. Thank you so much for having me on. The only thing I'll say is for folks who might be interested, if you're interested in grabbing the record or learning more about it or any of my projects, you can just go to www.theoudplayer.com. It has articles and artist depictions and information and all kinds of stuff. The record comes out November 12th, which is in about 3 weeks. And I also have pre-orders, which will be started on November 1st. It'll be digitally and hard copy CD available. So I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you again so much for having me on. I think you're doing a great job with these podcasts. We need stuff like this. So good job, man.
Thanks a lot. It's always great to have a fellow Armenian. I'm so glad we're doing this. And anytime you're welcome. So I hope we do many more of these.
Likewise, and hopefully soon I can interview you so we can learn about all the great stuff you do as well.
Thanks a lot, man. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
All right. You too, brother.
Take care.